Thank you and welcome to Transforming Cities, Gentrification and Urban Contestations in Istanbul and London. This is an event organised by the Centre for Policy and Research on Turkey and the LSE-SU Turkish Society. And so from all of us up here, thank you to everyone behind the scenes who organised this so professionally and for inviting you all here at the LSE. I will be your chair for tonight. My name is Aysegul Can and I'm a research fellow at LSE Cities, which is an international centre focusing on how the design of cities impacts on society, culturally and the environment here within sociology. And it's really an honour to be able to present the speakers that we've got here today. We've got Professor Loretta, who is chair in Human Geography at the University of Leicester. She's an urban geographer who is internationally known for her research on gentrification, urban regeneration, global urbanism, urban policy, urban public space, architecture, and urban social theory. That's a lot of knowledge.
Urban social movement.
And life.
Social movement. Social movement.
We've got Dr. Bahar Sakizoglu, and I'm sorry my pronunciation as a Venezuelan Brit. Some of you, I'm trying my best, yeah.
I'll correct you.
Is a postdoctoral research fellow in human geography at the University of Leicester, and her main research interests are accumulation by dispossession, gentrification, gender and displacement. And then Clara, Rivas, Alonso, who is a PhD candidate in human geography at the University of Leicester. Her PhD is titled Everyday Practices and Perceptions of Resistance Embedded in Processes of State-led Gentrification in in Istanbul. And we have our respondent, discussant, Aysegul Can, who received her PhD from the University of Sheffield, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning in 2016, which focused on the renovation and regeneration projects and also on the gentrification concept in the historic neighbourhoods of Istanbul. The running order is going to go as follows. We'll have Loretta, Bahar and Clara, and speaking for about 20 minutes each. And then Aysegul will respond to that in about 10 minutes. And then we'll open up for a Q&A for around 50 minutes. There'll be plenty of opportunity for questions, comments, and so on. So please do participate. I would like to ask you all to put your phones on silent, but please do tweet away. The Twitter hashtag for this event is #LSE Contestation. And in unlikely event of an emergency or a fire, the exit is over there.
Social movement.
Entrance. And I'd like to welcome Loretta to the stage.
Thank you very much. How do I find my PowerPoint?
It's on the desktop.
It's on the... Is it? Oh, you want to yeah, brilliant. Okay. Right. Stand sideways so I don't block the screen. That's better. Okay, well thank you very much for inviting me. Do I need this or can I do without? Can you hear me without? Yeah? I'm pretty loud. Okay, well thank you very much, Surgeon, etc. for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously I'm not Turkish, but I have been to Istanbul a number of times, but I've got the pleasure of working with an excellent postdoc and an excellent PhD student of mine who've done some amazing work on Istanbul to kind of give a bit more depth to what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about transforming cities, gentrification and urban contestation in Istanbul and London, and obviously we're here in London. Actually, let's go back a minute. What I want to do is begin by outlining something that myself, Shin, who is in the geography department at LSE, and Ernesto Lopez-Morals, who's in the planning department at the University of Chile, have termed planetary gentrification. So I want to kind of outline what that is, before moving on to look at gentrification in Istanbul by way of introduction to the kind of depth these guys are going to give. I then want to look at what's happening in London at the moment, before turning to a discussion of both resistance and contestation, specifically around gentrification, And then my colleagues Bahar and Clara will zoom in on two particular neighbourhoods that they've been researching in terms of both gentrification but also resistance. Okay, so I want to actually start then going back to when I became interested in, I guess, gentrification going global and what that actually meant. So back in 2012, so what's that, 6 years ago now, I published a paper in Progress in Human Geography that asked gentrification studies to extend and rethink its earlier and long-standing work on the geography of gentrification in conversation with new work that I was quite excited about, called the new comparative urbanism. My concern at the time was that there had been little to no discussion about appropriate theory to analyse gentrification supposedly emerging in the global south, nor of how they might actually play out differently in the predominantly non-white cities of the global south. I was also concerned about the rhetoric about the globalisation of gentrification, so terms being bandied around like gentrification generalised, as if A, this process had somehow moved north to south, west to east, and that it was somehow the same everywhere. So what I wanted gentrification studies and scholars to do was move away from what I thought was an imitative urbanism, from this idea that gentrification in the global north had somehow travelled to and been copied in the global south, towards what I called a cosmopolitan urbanism, drawing on the new comparative urbanism, where gentrification in the global south, and by global south I also mean global east, in other words, kind of non-Anglo-America, towards a much more expanded imagination. So better kind of thought processes on what was going on elsewhere. I felt that this was actually quite a significant mind shift because, of course, the gentrification studies literature had long been dominated by Anglo-American theory. And it did require a comparative imagination that could respond to what essentially was a post-colonial challenge. And that this would have implications, of course, for how gentrification as a process was being conceived, questioning the usefulness and applicability of the term in the global south, but also how this research was to be conducted, pushing us to learn new kinds of urbanism and involving multiple translations throughout the world. As the geographer Andrew Harris had argued, rather than exporting Eurocentric understandings of gentrification to the global south, we need to learn from the new sharp-edged forms of gentrification emerging in the previously peripheral cities of the global south. So in this way I argued in this paper that some of the more parochial assumptions, practices and languages of gentrification needed to be provincialised and re-examined, and that's essentially what I set out to do. The long story I won't go into here, ended up twinning up with Hun Shin here at LSE and Ernesto Lopez-Morals, University of Chile. We produced, from an Urban Studies Foundation piece of research, two main books. One, an edited collection called Global Gentrification's Uneven Development and Displacement, and a monograph called Planetary Gentrification. In addition, we had two special issues, one on Latin America in urban geography, and one in urban studies on East Asian gentrifications. And what we did here was we questioned the persistence of this Western ideology of urbanism, or actually anti-urbanism, that kind of floats around Anglo-American urban theory, which we felt may not exist, or at least not in the same way, in non-Western contexts, where, for example, issues like informality, state developmentalism, and even the concept of the neighbourhood itself could take on quite radically different meanings. So what we did in this work was, and this was over a period of years, building upon recent urban studies scholarship that has revisited the concept of the urban and the process of urbanisation at multiple scales. What we set out to do was to take a look and also then advance the view, or that was our conclusion, was advancing the view, that gentrification had unfolded at a planetary scale, but it was not simply generalised. Okay? And Neil Smith had talked about gentrification as generalised, as the leading edge of global urban theory. Rather, what we found is that there were generalisations, and this is quite different. So this foray into planetary gentrification did a number of things. Firstly, we narrated planetary gentrifications and the configurations between their paths. So rather than just looking at point A and point B, we were really interested in that in-betweenness, which a lot of people ignore. Focusing on the ascendancy of the secondary circuit of real estate. So this was offering a global perspective that considers colonialisms in different parts of the world, analytical but also everyday comparativisms, globalisation, and also, importantly, the globalised effects of financial capitalism. Third, we acknowledged other types of post-colonialisms, old colonialisms, old post-colonialisms, and new ones. We also demonstrated planetary indigeneity, in other words, organic gentrifications that are not copies of those in the West. And finally, this work problematises translations west to east, north to south, and vice versa. It demonstrates a much more complex situation. So what this work does then, what these series of publications do, is they show that gentrification is a phenomenon that cities worldwide have experienced, but it is not totally new in the 21st century to the global south. And gentrification has been and is being experienced through quite different types of urban restructuring around the world. And of course, those different types of urban restructuring are quite different to the kind of ones that influence Anglo-American theory. So to some extent, our book is a response to my old colleague when we both used to work at King's College across the road, to the Marxist geographer Andy Merrifield's recent call for what he calls a reloaded urban studies, which calls for the removal of centre periphery binary thinking, acknowledging the emergence of multiple centralities across urbanising spaces. And what he says is dispensing all those old chestnuts between global north and global south, between developed and underdeveloped worlds, urban and rural, urban and regional, city and suburb, just as we need to dispense with the old distinctions between public and private, state and economy, and politics and technocracy. Now you might wonder I'm talking about the global south here. Why have I put a picture of gentrification in Los Angeles up? Well, it's really to prove a point here about this kind of reloaded urban studies. So you can see the dark blue areas on the map are the areas that are heavily gentrifying in Los Angeles at the moment. So I guess the first point to make is that Los Angeles never thought it would gentrify, so it isn't the kind of deindustrialised, hollowed-out city like New York or Chicago. It was a suburban city, it was multi-nucleated, it was dominated by the car, it was not the kind of location you would expect to see gentrification. But in the last 10 or 15 years, processes of gentrification have emerged all over Los Angeles. And it kind of demonstrates that it's not just a central city phenomenon anymore. And I think that blurring and those breaking downs of those kind of distinctions are really, really important. And I think LA is actually quite a nice example of this. Like the Subaltern Studies School, which questioned universalising Western Marxist categories for studying historical, social and economic change in South Asia, but who wanted to retain a Marxist analysis, we also wanted to separate ourselves from Marxism's universalist history of capital, the nation and the political, and from readings of class consciousness that did not travel well to contexts outside of the industrialised West. So if you think about it, Marxist theory was premised on the Industrial Revolution, the industrialist city, and the kind of emergence of the proletariat and stuff like that. That doesn't play out the same in different parts of the world where that experience has not been the same. So although we still wanted to retain critical political economy, we didn't want the universalisation that kind of goes with that. And of course that's a really difficult balance to get. So like the Subaltern Studies School, we also insist then on a Marxist focus on the struggles of subaltern groups, the oppressed, and the alienated in urbanising societies. And this for us very much aligns us with a critical political economy approach. But I think that our focus has been quite distinctive. It's been quite different to the focus of people who do work in new comparative urbanism, who are predominantly from development studies or development geography. our focus is not just on the injustice of the neglect or misrecognition of southern or third world cities. So, for example, the work of Jenny Robinson is very focused on that. Ours is also about the injustice of class exploitation and accumulation by dispossession. And in addressing this, what we do is we retain a critical political economy framework, but our methodologies in many ways have been taken from post-colonial theory. So in planetary gentrification, what we do is we argue that the role of the state has been under-conceptualised in gentrification studies to date. And in so doing, we show how urban governance in metropolises in the global south has entered what the geographer Seth Schindler has called a territorial moment, in which municipal governments, so city governments, are increasingly focused on transforming urban space rather than improving populations. And of course you can see this in London, and I'll talk about this in a minute as well. Governments in southern metropolises are excited at the possibility of accumulating capital at the same time as remaking their cities on the world stage often. So reinvestment in the secondary circuit of capital, the built environment or real estate, is key to this process. In some parts of the global south, this is happening at the same time as investment in the primary circuit of capital, so the kind of traditional kind of investment in industrial production, for example, and China's a nice example of this. In its modernisation programmes, it kind of took the both at the same time. It invested in industry and in real estate and built environment at the same time. In other places, reinvestment in the secondary circuit, real estate or built environment, is trumping reinvestment in the primary circuit. So, for example, the kind of spectacular urbanisation you get in places like Dubai is a good example of that. But importantly, with planetary urbanisation, rural places and suburban spaces have become integral moments of what we call neo-industrial production and financial speculation, getting absorbed and reconfigured into new world regional zones of exploitation, into what Andy Merrifield has called megalopolitan regional systems. So, how does that all take us to Turkey, to Istanbul? So, from the 1980s into the early 1990s, gentrification was not used as an analytical tool by urban researchers in Turkey to describe the upgrading processes occurring in rundown neighbourhoods. That's no longer the case. From the late 90s onwards, a large and actually really excellent gentrification literature has emerged on Turkish gentrification processes, more especially since changes in urban policy began to enact state-led processes of gentrification, and indeed since the international headline-hitting anti-gentrification protests in Gezi Park in Istanbul in the summer of 2013. The early studies of gentrification in Istanbul in many ways mimicked the kind of classic gentrifications that people talked about in cities like London and New York, the kind of historic preservation of old, dilapidated, historic architecture. And you can see here quite clearly that once that rehabilitation happened in Istanbul, many of these places then subsequently also became kind of places where tourists went to look at this kind of architecture, because of course it felt safe, because it had been rehabilitated. But the more recent work has explicitly focused on the state-led demolition and rebuilding of certain inner-city neighbourhoods. And these are these territorial moments that our planetary gentrification book talks about. Urban transformation is seen by Turkish politicians to be a remedy for the problems caused by rapid urbanisation. While in the past it was used as a tool to formalise informal settlements, so here we have the informality I was talking about in planetary gentrification, so Gecekondu. The recent transformation agenda, however, also targets formal inner-city neighbourhoods, as well as Gecekondu areas. So in Turkey, urban transformation has been declared as an urban policy by the state, with a high level of determination. So to some degree, Neil Smith is right. Gentrification in this case is an example of that kind of leading edge of neoliberal urbanism. And to some degree, there are correlations with what's going on in other parts of the world. However, there are also quite distinct differences. So, of course, the term gentrification refers to the direct or indirect displacement effects of these large-scale projects, and the similarities of these projects with state-led gentrification projects elsewhere in the world are quite notable. Now Bahar, because my Turkish is non-existent, is going to talk about the translation of gentrification into Turkish, which I think is really interesting in its own right. And actually, a lot of how we got into this planetary gentrification work, we started thinking about what terms we used in other places and how they related or not to gentrification, whether they were the same or different. You know, so for example, in France, in Paris, they talk about bourgeoisement, which they claim is not gentrification. So lots of debate over this kind of stuff, but Bahar will introduce you to that. To date, scholars of Turkish gentrification have tried to analyse the transformation of inner-city neighbourhoods in Turkey using already existing Anglo-American concepts and theories. But scholars like these ladies here are now, I think, leading the way in researching gentrification in Istanbul, thinking outside this Anglo-American box. Now, of course, it's a bit of a kind of stereotype that, you know, Istanbul is this place where West meets East, where the global North meets the global South. It's both European but also Asian facing. But I think that's actually quite important, quite critical and interesting, because it makes it a site in which we can consider this new comparative urbanism of gentrification in different ways, because you do have that kind of touching. And I think contemporary gentrification in Istanbul is one encounter where East does meet West. And I think this has become especially interesting in more recent years when the Erdogan government's programme of Islamisation has meant that pre-existing areas of Western-style gentrification have come under attack, especially the cafes and bars and tourist areas near, for example, Taksim Square. One of my visiting PhD students a couple of years ago was doing a project on this, and she talks about the clash of gentrification and conservatism in Turkey. And the conservatism is a new socio-political norm based on tradition, religion, and Ottoman identity. So I think that kind of coming together there is really interesting. Okay, so back to London, where I live and where we're talking today. So, London is now what I would call hyper-gentrified. Now, this is not the super gentrification I talked about in the early 2000s in places like Barnsley and Islington. It's a much more frenzied and aggressive form of gentrification, driven by extremely high land values, speculation, money laundering, land grabbing, overseas buyers and investment, and there are numerous actors who are now complicit in this process, from the GLA to local councils, to developers, even housing associations. There is even private rental gentrification, imported from New York City, as the newly redeveloped vantage point next to the tube near where I live in Archway demonstrates. And we've got some images here. So that's the new vantage point just above Archway Tube where I live in London. And this was a model imported by a developer from New York City. The idea being that the buy-to-let kind of gentrification market had exhausted itself, and if we could provide these fully furnished high-end apartments that young professionals could just move straight into, with a pizza oven on the roof, with a gym, with a movie theatre within the building, then literally they could walk into this lifestyle. And apparently this had been successful in New York City. They claimed it had never been done in London, so they brought it to my neighbourhood, unfortunately. You know, these obviously are the kind of people we're after. But you can see that there are hot zones, there are hot spots, and of course the property developers, the speculators know where these are. Particularly at the moment, East London and South London are under attack. The work I've been doing on the kind of privatisation of council estates, you can see all of these council estates here are under threat of gentrification. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Because of course council estates are the final brick walls in the total gentrification of inner London. And gentrification scholars, like my old friend and colleague Tim Butler, used to say that council estates were protecting London from total gentrification. He never would have thought they'd be gentrified. But there's now cross-party consensus on dismantling council estates, and I'm saying that with the whole HDB thing this week, that seems possibly to be changing, and fingers crossed that will happen. So to give you an example of this, so The gentrification of the Haygate estate in Elephant and Castle has now already happened, and this has become symbolic of the gentrification of council estates. 1,212 of these council flats were demolished, and the Elephant Park was replaced. That council estate, all of the previous council tenants have been moved off. This new development was sold off plan to the East Asian market. The local council used the moral agenda of mixed communities policy, arguing that they were deconcentrating policy and creating social and economic uplift of the poor. This is what they actually did. They kicked the poor out. So every single person got displaced from that council estate in the Haygate. Now, of course, it's this kind of insanity that's really got resistance to gentrification really growing in London. And it used to be that places like New York were much better at resisting gentrification, but London's beginning to catch up. And I think resistance has really grown. But what's fascinating for me is actually the gentrification studies literature says very little about this. It says even less about successful resistance. The mentions tend to be sketchy or rhetorical with very little in-depth research. And of course, resistance is not some singular thing. There are many different forms and practices, and they need to be researched in context. So, of course, the ones that we're familiar with, because they made international headlines, the anti-gentrification protests against the serial killer cafe that sells 10 quid bowls of cereal from, Fruit Loops to whatever. And in fact, bizarrely, I was interviewed for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation on this, and it was on the Canadian nighttime news, and all these gentrification scholars like David Lay were suddenly watching this and were like, oh my God, what's going on in London? Because, of course, London is not seen as this hotbed of anti-gentrification activism, but it certainly is becoming that way. But there's also been pushback. So, of course, the media coverage of the Haringey development vehicle, where the borough of Haringey is basically trying to sell off most of its public assets, including most of its council estates, to the private developer Lend-Lease, who've gentrified the Haygate estate, and there's been a whole fuss about this. But people who've pushed back against this have tried to argue that this is the hard left taking over the borough, but it's a much more complex story than that. But these public protests are just one part of resistance. The stuff that I'm increasingly interested in is the legal dimension to this. So I've got a paper coming out in the next issue of City talking about the legal fight against the gentrification of the Aylesbury estate. So I've just spent the last 3 weeks in the revised Aylesbury estate public inquiry. The images here are from the first one in 2015. But there's been next to nothing written about legal fights against gentrification, bizarrely. So it's here that the 2016 CPO public inquiry victory, we won the first one, even though it got turned for various reasons, was particularly significant. Because what it did is it considered loss of place rather than loss of housing per se, and it recognised the legal right to dwell, that one might be invoked in instances when a given community is under threat. So in many ways, that battle set a precedent, because it suggests that while it might sometimes be necessary for residents to take to the streets to protest, there is actually significant room for those seeking spatial justice to invoke the language's rights, to impose enforceable obligations on London boroughs to protect their populations from displacement. But I'm not so naive to assume that that's possible everywhere. Because, of course, all kinds of resistance are not always possible everywhere, particularly in authoritarian contexts. And we only need to look at the unnecessarily aggressive response to the easy anti-gentrification protests in Istanbul to see this, where at least 4 people were killed by police violence. So just to finish off, some of the work that I've been doing with Clara here and Sandra Annunziata, who's an Italian urbanist, we've been interested in looking at new ways of thinking about resistance, particularly in contexts where it's hard to do that kind of resistance, whether they be authoritarian or whatever. And indeed, when looking at gentrification outside of Euro-America, and actually sometimes even in it, it's important to look at other types of resistance. So what we do is we discuss the importance and value of everyday practice of resistance that can be visible or invisible, that are linked to survivability. So what we try to put on the table is this notion of survivability as a critical concept that holds real promise for a properly global gentrification studies, because it's constantly negotiated in and through informality, invisibility, temporalities, and the limits to solidarity. Solidarity is not always easy with these things. In addition, the concept of survivability introduces a welcome perspective of individual action into the field of gentrification studies, which has often tended to make assumptions about collectiveness in terms of resistance. In fact, the paper makes a crucial point that any understanding of resistance to gentrification needs to be tempered by the fact that individuals need to focus foremost on their individual survival and welfare. If you're about to be made homeless, are you obsessed with protesting, or are you obsessed with where you're going to put your children the next night to sleep? In reality, planetary resistance to gentrification is composed of both overt opposition and everyday, often invisible resistances, which we argue are entangled in a constant process of becoming. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. I would like to first thank the organizers who put this evening together and for all of you to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussions that we will have in the end. I am doing my postdoc right now on the gender geographies of gentrification. This is a comparative work in Istanbul and in Amsterdam. But today I will be talking about the symbolic politics of state-led gentrifications in Istanbul. I will first let me tell you what is on the agenda. I'll first be talking about the conceptual tool that I'll be using. And then I will give you, Loretta already did it, but a little bit of snapshot of political economic context of gentrifications in Turkey. Then I'm talking about my methodology and my case, and lastly the conclusions and a little bit of reflection as a gentrification researcher for the last more than 10 years. Okay, if we start with the conceptual tool, the translation of the term gentrification into Turkish has been subjected to discussion. Three among several words are commonly used. And the first one is soylulaşma, that means becoming noble. And the second one is mutenalaşma, it's just coming from the adjective mutena, which is an old Arabic word for being exclusive and select and distinguished. And some scholars, including me, use soylulaştırma, which is focusing on the fact that gentrification, the translation soylulaşma, is not a natural phenomenon, and making an emphasis on the agency of turning a neighborhood into a gentrified place. And this is basically and there are many of these words, and the main distinction between soylulaşma and mutenalaşma is that the ones who are against the word soylulaşma or the term soylulaşma are just discussing that there is not nobles, like as we know in the Western context, that not really in the Turkish history. So mutena is just coming from the old Arabic language, like the word is coming from there, and that it's more reflecting the Turkish society and the fact. That's basically it. And then if I go on with the symbolic politics, I use Bourdieu's definition of symbolic politics, which is the struggle over the power to promote visions of reality and impose visions of reality. And I see it as an integral part of gentrification politics. Symbolic politics of gentrification refers to the ways in which gentrification is framed and experienced by different actors. And this is totally, and in turn shapes when gentrification takes place, who benefits from that, and who gets displaced at the end of the process. And I will here consider two dimensions of symbolic politics. The first one is the politics of classification. This involves the ways in which different actors ascribe meanings to the neighborhood and the residents who are living in these neighborhoods. State authorities involved in the classification of the neighborhoods and their residents, and when a neighborhood is declared a no-go area or a lawless place, a certain stigma is attached to this neighborhood, which is then mobilized to legitimize certain interventions in these neighborhoods. And this state-sanctioned stigma is pushing these neighborhoods into further cycle of disinvestment and decay later on. And secondly, the politics of time, considering gentrification. State authorities use time as a tool to create unequal symbolic power relations involved in this process. Control over time involves the power to take the initiative and strategically to postpone certain interventions and accelerate to maximize bargaining power at certain points, as I will show in the case study. And holding the privilege of the powerful state and its partners, mostly the private companies, they have the ability to create uncertainty, to impose certain deadlines, to push the renewal plans, and also have the ability to delay these projects, resulting in anxious waiting in these neighborhoods. Okay. Now the political and economic context of step-led gentrifications. This context is marked by AKP's ruling at the three different levels: the national, the city, and the district. And most of the country, not really all the country, because there are differences. Some of the districts are run by the opposition party and the Kurdish party. But we can say that this is really a sort of the second historic moment in the Turkish history that we have this unity at the three levels from 2000 on. And AKP, especially the President Erdogan, uses urban development as the main harbinger of the economy, and in a very authoritarian way. His own term, crazy projects for Istanbul, includes the Canal Istanbul that totally destroys, cuts the tree into three parts and destroys the morphology and the water basins of the city totally. And the third airport that raised the northern forest of Istanbul and caused really a lot of damage, as you can see here, already before the construction. And AKP involves AKP involves the capital groups that are close to its party line, and regarding urban renewal projects in several cities, and there is strong clientelist coalition between the political and economic actors involved in this process. As a third point, the party prepared the legislative and institutional infrastructure of step-led gentrifications, legally extending the power of state authorities. And as the fourth factor, Turkish state uses different tools to manage step-led gentrifications, and recent years witnessing more extensive use of brutal violence. That was the case in the protest under the state of emergency nowadays. Okay. After the heavy curfews in Kurdish cities, we always talk about gentrification in Istanbul and the big cities, but after the heavy curfews in Kurdish cities in the last 2 years, the state started using gentrification as a political pacification and economic redevelopment strategy. This is from one of the Kurdish cities, the article. And AKP from 2000 on helped develop, that's also the point that Loretta mentioned, developed an Islamic middle class, middle and upper middle class, and it attracted Middle Eastern investment and tourists and engaged in a symbolic struggle, inserting Islamic elements into the city of Istanbul and other cities. such as the very contested mosque project in the middle of Taksim Square, as you can see in the picture below. And all these together are bringing the emergence of veiled gentrification of consumption spaces in the city, together with the de-gentrification of the very secular and gentrified part of the city, such as Beyoğlu and Galata. And that changes the face of gentrification. So, my methodology. So this study is based on a qualitative methodology, and I conducted 48 interviews with residents, got the private company, the municipal authorities and neighborhood organization, and I did participant observations and document analysis, and this is basically covering the research like from 2005 on. I have a longitudinal project going on. So, let's now start with the case study. Tarlabaşı is a deprived and ethnically mixed neighborhood in Beyoğlu, which is very close to the Taksim Square, where Gezi happened. This neighborhood used to be in the 19th century and had a large presence of non-Muslim minorities, but after the displacement of these non-Muslim minorities due to xenophobic policies, the neighborhood became home to Kurdish and international migrants who were mostly forced displacees from their own cities or countries. And high unemployment, low school attendance, low schooling rates, poverty marked the neighborhood, and central location of the neighborhood, access to informal labor markets, cheap rents, operate as the poverty alleviation mechanisms in this neighborhood. So prior to urban renewal in Tarlabaşı, there was a delicate balance regarding the relations between different groups in this neighborhood. Many residents belong to the very stigmatized groups in the city, such as Roma, Kurds, transgender sex workers, migrants from Africa, and recyclers, and more. Mutual stigmatization among these different groups was strong and is still strong. But conflicts and tensions did occur, of course, but since these people were relegated to live in this area, they found a way not to escalate these conflicts and very delicate balance in the neighborhood just because they were relegated to live in this area and couldn't actually move out. And Tarlabaşı Renewal Project. Tarlabaşı was designated as one of the renewal areas in Beyoğlu in 2005. In 2006, the municipality got the right to expropriate properties whose owners didn't want or wouldn't want to agree with the terms of the project. So they basically had to agree. And the renewal area includes 2,078 buildings in 9 building lots. And they will build hotels, luxurious housing, office spaces, and it's a public-private partnership with a company called GAP. I will refer in the presentation. That's not here, but the provisions for the residents, there were 3 options for the property owners. The first is they would get 42% of their current floor place space of their property in the renewed area, and right to buy a mass housing estate in the peripheries of the city, and the third is a monetary compensation for the current price of their housing. Formal tenants did get the right to buy a house in the mass housing at the periphery of the city, and occupiers or squatters and informal tenants did get nothing. And the last category was the 45% of the entire population living in the renewal area. Okay, these are the pictures of the municipal government about the renovations to take place before and after. And let's now look at how the politics of classification operated during this process. First, I will mention about the state-sanctioned stigma. So in the discourse of the municipal authorities, Tarlabaşı multicultural cost is appreciated, but in today of television is seen as a center of negativity, place for criminals and terrorists. And it needs to be cleansed from this current state and modernized. And this stigmatization of the neighborhood legitimizes the designation of the neighborhood as an urban renewal area. And the authorities and the private company not only stigmatize the neighborhood using these arguments, but they drive a line between the residents, just calling some worthy and some others unworthy. And that allowed them to divide and rule the neighborhood and resistance, basically. If I go on with the classification of the neighborhood, the residents, the main line of the differentiation was between stakeholders with and without formal tenure rights. Only the property owners were formally recognized as stakeholders. And as the project manager of the private company stated, there were three groups of owners that they considered. The first was the non-Muslim Assyrian and Armenian minority foundations. They were considered as the cultural heritage of the area. And actually the municipality and the private company made concessions to keep these people, the property owners, in this area. And the second group was the small formal business owners and shopkeepers. First, they were not offered any commercial spaces within this area, but then, after the negotiations, they were given the right to come back as long as they would just upgrade their business and serve the clientele of the newcomers, basically, in the area. So if you have a tea house, you would just turn it into a restaurant or a cafe that would just attract these people. The third is the urban poor, as this manager called, who owned small, rundown and modest houses. And they were basically wanted to sell their place and go live somewhere else. And some formal renters were offered the right to buy a house at mess housing, and some informal renters with good connections at the municipality were also offered, and some, the poorest of the poor, were also offered transportation support and some months of rent. But these provisions, especially the last ones that I mentioned, were totally arbitrary and clientel. Another line for differentiating was illegality. In the run-up to the renewal operation, the government intensified its surveillance in the neighborhood, including raids on undocumented migrants, on the Kurdish organizations or activists, inspections on the business licenses and tax liabilities, and that's totally an informal neighborhood, and it has been like that for quite some time, and it has been also not checked before. And let me go with the politics of power. So, the property owners, to start with them, were subjected to effective temporal politics in this process. The process was, from the beginning, marked by uncertainty. There were the rumors of renewal, and that everyone would be compensated. And this raised hopes in the neighborhood. And the municipality first had the owners wait for the actual plans to be announced, and then suddenly accelerated the process to force them into quick decisions. A number of owners couldn't resist the pressure and signed the agreements. The others, who didn't want to give in, were then forced to tedious, costly juridical processes and extended the period of uncertainty to go through. And tenants had much fewer rights than property owners. They were forced into an anxious waiting for decisions of their landlords to sell or the outcomes of the court cases. And this process took from 2007, when the project was announced, to 2012. So basically 5 years and 6 years before that, there were the rumors of the project. So, how all this affected the contestation. Some shopkeepers and property owners established the Tarlabaşı Association in 2008 to challenge the municipal plans. The primary goal was to engage in collective negotiations. The association initially reached out to property owners and tenants living in the area. They used a lot of tools, including reaching out to international institutions, yes, like the European Court of Human Rights or Amnesty, to protest the evictions in the neighborhood, just to put pressure on the national authorities. And the mobilization was impressive. It seemed that all the ingredients for successful mobilization and contestation was there. Yet in time, the classification of the residents and different time regimes imposed on different groups shaped the possibilities and impossibilities for collective action in the neighborhood. The opposition was not effective for two reasons. The first, that it was divided in time. Although the residents in the area first appeared to unite in the face of external threats, the differentiation of the residents further amplified already existing tensions in the neighborhood and among the residents. And the second reason was second reason for the weakness of the opposition is that the resistance mobilized all sorts of resources but lost the momentum as the pressures increased and people were forced into setting. And if I jump to conclusion, because I'm running out of time, the case of Tarlabaşı Istanbul tells us the importance of the role of state in the making of gentrification, and hence the necessity of enlarging our conceptual toolbox to understand the symbolic power and politics involved in this process. And we need to see the scope of the state's toolbox to manage this process in order to strengthen the mobilization against it also. And especially in the Turkish case, and I'm quite sure in many other places as well, the importance of states' discretionary power, like tilting the balance between formal and the informal, creating uncertainty, and distributing some provisions, but in a very arbitrary way, needs more elaboration. And I want to finish with only one reflection because of the time limitations. The methodological I'll go for. So, in my own comparative research projects, 2 or 3 I'm talking about, like, and that was in basically Amsterdam and Istanbul. What I did was starting my fieldwork always in Istanbul, and then carrying this experience and the questions of Istanbul to the Western context. And that's basically, the first question I had in my mind, like, there's so much informality, there's so much state violence, there's so much this and that in this case of Istanbul, and what does it mean, and how does it translate to the case of Amsterdam? And that actually made me see more in the case of Amsterdam. Where is informality, for instance? And what are the tools of the state to manage this process, for instance? And there was a lot more informality that I would see if I didn't have this background. And it was really incredible, like the scope of informality. And you need to ask the right questions to get in there. And if you don't have this background, then it becomes really difficult to break in that formal, very formal context of urban renewal and understand what is informal in there. And the second thing was just this, having this very longitudinal approach, like from 2005 on, I started this student, like in Istanbul 2005 till now, and in Amsterdam 2008 till now. So this groundedness is actually operating as a sort of comparative urbanist training. So you know what kind of developments are coming, and you're not really jumping to any new neighborhood that is gentrifying or something of that sort. Like, and keeping grounded in where you're doing your research and just seeing how it is changing makes you feel like more secure regarding the questions that you're asking, but at the same time theoretically and methodologically sane. Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Clara. Sorry, this has started to work with us. Let me just try to. Should be like that, probably. And I'm a PhD candidate with Loretta at the University of Leicester. Do you mind giving me a hand?
I'm not really sure. My technological abilities, yeah.
It's kind of automatically starting to the next slide. Let me see. I'm Googling it now.
I'll click on the slide.
It's just turning slide.
Transitions with the on mouse, you just have to untick that task.
Sorry. Thank you so much. So thanks Research 30 for putting us together, and fantastic to see a full house and share this platform with these great women. So I'm doing a PhD on everyday practices and perceptions of resistance in Okmekdane in Istanbul. Now it works. In this presentation, I draw from this case study. Okmekdane is a neighborhood that is historically stigmatized in Istanbul. And first of all, for the non-Turkish speakers, sorry, this has gone wild.
I think it's freaking out. What did not say also there? That's nice.
Okay, so. Fingers crossed. So, for the non-Turkish speakers, this graffiti on the wall of a local school means there is no turning back. Something like this, Burada mek var, dönmek yok. This somehow dramatic introduction to Okmekdane echoes mainstream narratives about the place that stigmatize it and attempt to throw it into the margins, both symbolically and literally speaking. Here, Gonen and Yonuju's work on similar neighborhoods is crucial as they link this stigmatization to processes of urban transformation, Greek gentrification. And yet, Okmekdane is so much more than that, as Jean-François Paulus has argued. So we need to go beyond these mainstream narratives to see a clear picture of what's going on. My questions are, what is the role of militarization of spaces within processes of implementation of and resistance to urban renewal projects? And to what extent perceptions of identity and belonging inform opinions about urban renewal projects and movements of resistance? So attempting to answer these questions have highlighted issues that are actually intertwined. Both ideas of individual and collective identity and belonging are influenced by the security breakdown, state crackdown, and conflict that with different intensity has gripped the neighborhood for decades. Therefore, when an urban renewal project threatens the dwellers of Okmekdane, different aspects of these perceptions are activated, as I will try to explain in the following slides. So a couple of notes about my ethnography, about my methodology. The position I was in raised a number of important questions, ethical and positionality questions. How my involvement was shaping the gathered information, the gathered data, what sources I was able and unable to access, issues about what information I was going to mobilize, not only to protect informants, but did I really want to make everything available? They were best exemplified by the amount of times taxi drivers asked me, "Sen ne işin var burada?" Which means, I'm going to loosely translate as, what is someone like you doing in a place like this? Before swiftly leaving the neighborhood as fast as possible. So hopefully we will have some time to discuss this kind of ethical questions in the questions and answers. So, a little geographical introduction to the case. Here you have a blueprint of two of the most well-known urban renewal plans you might have heard of, Sulukule and Tarlabaşı, that Bahar has talked about. As you can see, the plan projected for Okmeydan is humongous, it's much bigger. Dubbed the biggest urban renewal plan in Turkey and in Europe even. Depending on who you ask, there are between 74 and 80,000 people living in Okmeydan. It's comprised by 6 administrative units or neighbourhood. It sits on the European side, as you can see, of Istanbul, and it's very close to one of the centres, Taksim, in Beyoğlu, Taksim and Istiklal. Very well connected to transport networks, about 15 minutes by bus or minibus to the center of Beyoğlu, and also well connected to the useful metrobus, which runs along the E5, which is the motorway around here. Initially, when dwellers settled in Okmeydan, this was actually the periphery of the city, and now as Istanbul has urbanized massively, it's actually the center of the city. Its borders, Okmeydan borders, are pretty unstable, and depending on who you talk to, you might find that Okmeydan is smaller, it's bigger, it comprises the area of Kaltane, or it doesn't. Historically, and reflected by its name, it held the archery area, Ok means arch, archery area, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II built in the 16th century. This is relevant as the historical owner of the land is actually the cultural foundation. During the 50s, the era of rapid industrialization in Turkey, many domestic migrants settled in this land, either buying it from previous Albanian owners or directly occupying the land near factories, where they proceeded to build their own houses, Gentrification. For example, you can see in this picture one of the gecekondus embedded in these 2 high-rise buildings. Since then, its ambiguous land ownership status has become one of the main narratives drawn upon most actors. The title deeds or tapu have been promised election after election, and tapu taxes, a substitute document, has been provided to many owners as the promise of formalization of home ownership. It grew vertically, especially in the 80s, as well as built high-story buildings with involvement of small-scale constructors or builders who would subsequently own some of the floors they built. And more groups came to the area. You have Kurds escaping the destruction of their villages in the southeast. You have different groups of precarious workers, such as African and Afghani migrants. And recently, you have a lot of Syrian families. Its central location, inexpensive rents, and informal textile workshops function as magnets for those in very precarious situations. Important timeline, the Gecekondu as an illegal settlement was actually amnestied in 1983-84, and in 2014 the area was declared earthquake risk area, which many saw as an excuse to implement the urban renewal project. So at the same time, and especially what some informants describe as Upper Okmeydan, is represented as in mainstream discourses as one of the hotbeds of leftist militant groups, alleged Kurdish identities, as is the case with other buildings like Gazi Mahallesi. Undoubtedly the connections are there, and yet these narratives are used to criminalize the neighborhood further. It was also brought into the limelight through the death of local teenager Berkin Elvan in the hands of the police during the Gezi Park protests. A little bit on the urban renewal plan, as you can see here. So a lot of dwellers fear that this plan is going to push them out and is going to further gentrify the center of Istanbul. In this case, as the plan takes over both Şişli municipality and the Beyoğlu municipality, it's very interesting to see what that administrative border does to the possibilities of resistance and how people organize. The biggest part of the renewal plan sits in the Beyoğlu municipality, and some see it as part of the urban policy pushed by Beyoğlu with an AKP mayor. Linking it to other famous plans such as the Tarlabaşı project, Haliç port, etc. The area in Shizli, which is at the top from this bit here, is actually not planned yet, and the Shizli municipality hasn't made any preparations in regards to the project yet, which might offer an advantage to those living there. In fact, the Shizli municipality is run by CHP, which is the opposition party. So this is also relevant as there are two associations currently fighting against the renewal plan, one based in Riolo and the other one based in Shizli. They work differently. So the local authorities have promised, and in some cases provided, Istanbul or home ownership document for buildings in the new renewal plan, with hardly any information about what kind of home it is for. What a lot of the dwellers have opted for is to fight to get the Istanbul for the current homes, so that they can be in a better position to negotiate. And the planning process, also as relayed by some of the informants, is a complicated and obscure process where there's no real consultation and which leads to legal battles every time a plan comes out. So in fact, this entails going back to the planning department, which alters the bare minimum and then releases it again. The consensus within the people I talked to was that Okmeydane had been chosen as a central area with a rent gap to take advantage of, and to some of them it was also a way of getting rid of those more politically active or vocal against the state, and in some cases some of the illegal groups that are said to function in the area. So what it would look like is something like that. This is the model in the exposed in the Rolu municipality, and it's commonly presented as the new Champs-Élysées of Istanbul. Now, I'd like to introduce you to some of the dynamics of conflict and militarization in the neighborhood. These pictures are not mine. The rest of these are not. I wouldn't dare getting close to any of this. Here you see the state embodied in its most brutal form. The back of a Toma, which is here, the water cannon vehicles, the police helicopter, the Akrets, which are these armored black vehicles. So you have this Toma, these water cannon vehicles, are stationed at the top of this part of the neighborhood constantly. And the Akrets, the armored vehicles, they do the rounds all the time, or they stay put in some parts of the neighborhood. Depending whether there was a day of commemoration or May Day or the anniversary of Berkin Elvan or the death of any fighters in the southeast, they would make use of tear gas and sound bombs. Helicopters are normally deployed every time the police is raiding an address. So bear in mind that all these are special forces, this completely dehumanized version of the police, normally masked if they're seen outside of their vehicle. There is also plenty of CCTV around, and more recently one of these Akrets ran over a Syrian kid and unfortunately killed him, just playing in the street. So the militarization of the neighborhood has been a constant process for the last 30 years. As someone told me, they know everything we do, they even know where we like to shop. But even the services, even public services are curtailed from this part of the neighborhood. Banks have closed down and they moved further. And as I was there, the bus service from Okmeydane would stop at 5 in the afternoon, when you have, in fact, a huge working population that finishes its working day at 8 in the evening or later, forcing commuters to cross the nearby motorway, which could be quite dangerous. So it's pretty surreal that this is happening 25-minute walk from taxiing from the cafes, shops, bars and restaurants of Beirut. This conflict is also spread on the walls of Okmeydane. The omnipresent political graffiti, slogans and posters reflect developments happening inside the quarter and in other areas of Turkey of intense political struggle. Covering most of the walls, they would change regularly and would also be used as a tool for mobilizing local support against the renewal plan, or to protest the lack of public transport, as I said before. This is an old Gecekondu house. In fact, through some kind of mirror effect, what happens in other geographies reverberates in Ogmaydane. If a fighter has been killed in the southeast or northern Syria, it can appear mentioned or even celebrated with a demonstration in the streets of the neighborhood. If there is a problem in Ghazi, another neighborhood that shares similar reputation with Ogmaydane, it's also felt here. This is a tribute to those who were killed during the Gezi Park protests. So this mural, which is hardly problematic, was covered by the police not long after it was painted. It's particularly interesting considering that I saw the face of Öcalan every day in all parts of the neighborhood and PKK slogans everywhere. That the fact that the police thought that this was more offensive was a clear sign of what they were really scared of. Also, what's happened since the state of emergency took place in Turkey is that the slogans are being painted over by the police at night, making their presence more visible and more obvious than before. This militarization of the neighborhood and the continuous conflict obviously affects the view of the dwellers I spoke to in regards to the state and the way they are being represented in mainstream narratives. So the constant insecurity felt as a neighborhood under siege is also there when talking about the future of their homes. So you have some of the views by some of the neighbors here. For example, everybody living in Ogmaydane has problems, psychological problems because of this situation, and again claiming Ogmaydane is our home. So sort of relaying this feeling of being under threat all the time. So excuse the smiley faces, but don't get me wrong also, they're not doing anything illegal or wrong, but just in case, it won't be through me that these people get into trouble. So it's better to be safe. So in spite of the distrust towards the state and the way that it treats the neighborhood, or maybe because of it, people mobilize. So visibility becomes important, and all the different actors engaging, creating some sort of momentum. It could be whenever the whole neighborhood was called for meetings in order to organize and inform, or whenever the Union of Neighborhoods, which is a nationwide organization, got together to share the experiences of struggle against urban renewal projects, gentrification, in order to devise strategies and further action. Or whenever the handling of applications of homeownership in the metropolitan municipality was taken as an opportunity to demonstrate and be very vocal about the plight of the residents. So when handouts like this were given around the neighborhood calling for others to join, forming a sense of collectivity. Don't touch my neighborhood, for example. So I wanted to pick one of the examples in order to describe this kind of resistance grounded in the everyday that we've kind of talked about before. So it's the case of the association in the photograph, OCDER, or the Ogmaydane Association for Social Cooperation and Solidarity, run by local dwellers, most of them having lived in the area for years, was initially founded as an organization against the urban renewal plan. So while it was dealing with how to organize, they also said that there were a lot of people in the neighborhood who were in massive need of assistance because they had either next to nothing or they lived in really precarious dwellings. So they attended, however, they could help to more than 500 Syrian families that came to this neighborhood. So with a firm belief in the idea that a stronger community will be able to resist better, they use the small space they have to have meetings to inform homeowners about how to apply for homeownership, to organize demonstrations, to arrange activities for the children, to teach English, or to secure donations. So they have also managed to get the municipality in Chisley to provide medical assistance to the refugees that were in need at the time. So these stories of solidarity are intertwined with the idea that neighbors need to take care of each other. In fact, they said, we are also arrived here with nothing and built our homes with the help of our relatives and friends. What is most impressive is that the precariousness of the refugees in particular didn't stop them, some of them, from joining the association in their marches against the renewal plan, when the case normally is that they tend to choose invisibility in order to not to get into trouble. Of course, not everyone in the neighborhood is ready to help the newcomers, but curiously, I think it's very interesting, the association used its leverage to improve the situation of those who were in most desperate need. The usual story is that the area is really sought after by the Syrians because it's not expensive, it's near the center, and it employs informally. So I've heard stories on how landlords double or triple the rents for the Syrians in particular. So what the association did was to talk to those landlords who they were actually helping at the same time to apply for title deeds, and persuaded them to lower the price for the refugees. So providing a highly effective bridge between those wanting to secure their position as homeowners and those tenants in precarious situations. So this, I wanted to introduce you to some conceptual streams that actually relate to what Loretta was talking about before, this concept of survivability that we've been working on. So the instances of very obvious resistance or contestation stem from these everyday stories created around the neighborhood, within its homes, its streets, the parks, the shops, and every space where the meaning of the neighborhood is actually negotiated and struggled for. So I approach these different forms of belonging through three different theoretical angles, as Loretta mentioned, temporalities, informality, and invisibility. And it might help, hopefully, to link that everyday with everyday practices with these overtly resistance practices. So you have the concept of temporalities, people attempting to mobilize, draw from their past experiences in order to solidify solidarity networks. So there was a clear sort of romanticization of the past, of this gecekondu past, informal past, where everyone knew each other, where it was very safe to go to stay in the streets. But it was this kind of idealized past that allowed people to build some kind of sense of belonging in the present in order to fight for their own future in the area. They also mentioned the fact that everyone knew each other and now they don't, referring to this, what they call hemsheri networks, which are the people that come from the same village. Also, there was a sense of historical injustice that needed to be solved. People had been promised time and time again these official homeownership documents, only to find themselves in a very precarious situation. So there's a feeling in all the data of some kind of future suspended for the buildings. Also, informality is an essential part of the everyday life that seeps into the way that resistance is being reproduced. Through these sharing networks, for example, the solidarity networks of everyday solidarities that are activated at times of when, for example, bigger mobilizations are being organized. As the association, for example, didn't only rely on posters or contacts or social media, they will call their networks to get people to come to their demonstrations. So the practices of invisibility, rooted in the everyday, were very important as well. What was made visible or invisible in regards to their relationship with the institutions was very important. For example, the situation of the Syrian refugees, as I said before. Also, many supported the association in a political way. They didn't want to say openly which party they would vote because that would cause friction, so they wanted to stay in sort of, they said, okay, we are neighbors, we are not one party or another, we are neighbors, basically. So let me move on a little bit. So, when asked about the futures, the dwellers were clear. As you can see, we will open barricades. So, we are yet to see what happens with Oakmaidan. But going by what I've seen and who I talked to, I think the implementation of the plan is going to be anything but smooth if it happens. But anyway, it has already demonstrated how resistance practices involve not only the more visible moments of contestation, but also the everyday life of neighbors living side by side, sharing a highly militarized space, precarious dwelling and job insecurity, among many other things. In fact, what I think is that without the more invisible networks of solidarity strengthened by cooperation, daily support and shared conditions and objectives, those overt resistance would not really happen. So back to the initial question, militarization and state violence deeply affects the possibilities of trust in the state. Thus, a state-sponsored urban renewal plan is widely seen as another mechanism to hurt the local population, especially those that have been politically active and oppose the current government. In fact, resistance is seen as part of the neighborhood's DNA, and yet organizing, as I said, is represented and carried out as an apolitical action, in the belief that more people will join the struggle. This, very quickly, I'm zooming out a bit now, and in an attempt to identify some kind of blueprint of resistance to gentrification, which Sandra and Iziata, another colleague, and also with Loretta, we have been working on. So we came up with this table that summarized different kinds of resistance practices to gentrification that actually come from very different geographies globally. So these ways of preventing, delaying, building awareness and counter-narratives, occupation and resisting eviction, and strategic practices of mobilization of collective identities and informal tactics can be seen in Oakmaidan and in other different places all over the planet, from Brazil to Spain even, and to, what Bahar was talking about, zooming out and using Istanbul as a lens to go to Amsterdam and talk about informality, for example. So, drawing also from relational comparative approaches that Loretta has talked about in Planetary Gentrification, it presents us with, I have sought, to understand the city as, and this neighborhood in particular, as constituted through their relationships with other places, adding also the fact that time is enacted differently by different actors as past, present, and future become highly contested, almost as contested as the land itself, in fact. The relational approach has allowed me to move away from essentialist understandings of Oakmaidan that fix it in narratives of stigmatization, that essential tool mobilized by governments, mainstream media, and public actors in order to justify urban intervention. On the other hand, it is impossible to deny the effect of the state of emergency and what I've just called here curfew urbanism. Can what happened in Sur in Diyarbakir become a model for more fighting neighborhoods like Oakmaidan? I guess we're going to wait and see what happens in the future. But in this context, critical perspectives are essential and need to be supported in any way we can, I think. Which leads me to the final slide. And a quick reminder of a few ideas for those interested in showing support and or trying to help colleagues that are working under threat, or have been dismissed, or have been prosecuted, or have been jailed or publicly vilified, or have simply lost their only source of income just because they supported the peaceful alternative. Thank you. That's all.
Hi, I'm
Aysegul Can, and I did my PhD in the University of Sheffield, and I also did my PhD on gentrification and urban renewation processes and urban renewal projects in 2 neighbourhoods in Istanbul, one in Galata and Tarlabaşı. And how I got interested in gentrification is mostly I started with market-led gentrification happening in the inner city historic neighbourhoods in Istanbul, which led me to other neighbourhoods in Istanbul like Tarlabaşı, and I realized that in Istanbul, even though the Anglo-American processes have been happening since the late 80s, there were other processes happening like state-led gentrification because of massive urban regeneration projects that traveled through the Tarlabaşı neighbourhood, which is actually what Bahar was talking about. And from these projects and from my PhD that I conducted almost 2-3 years ago, I got interested in the lack of affordable housing and the conflict that had been happening in the neighborhood, the learning that can be done from global south to the global north. And from that, actually, that brings us to Loretta's presentation. So especially in a time now there are talks about, in the gentrification circle, stretching out the term of gentrification, what can be called gentrification, or are we using gentrification as a way to all involve every kind of urban transformation process? It's really helpful and important to bring the term of planetary gentrification to see how it plays out, not only in the north, but also in the south. And because of that, now that we know that the gentrification has been happening in the south, in the global south, almost at the same time as it has been happening in the global north, maybe not in the same way, in different ways, but there are processes of gentrification that have been happening in the global south, like in the global north. It's pivotal to understand urban transformation from the lens of gentrification, while maybe updating this complex concept as through urban regeneration processes. And as you can see, the term of gentrification, when it's translated into Turkish, it brings out, and gentrification has always been a dirty word, but it brings out the most negative parts of gentrification, and it actually shows what kind of stigma that has been happening in Istanbul and in the Turkish case. Tarlabaşı is a unique case in the sense that it's so close to other neighborhoods that were gentrified through market-led gentrification, and that had similar kind of disadvantaged inhabitants residing in them. But even though that was the case, Tarlabaşı was never gentrified through market-led gentrification, and the state had to actually actively step in to make it happen, and even enable a law. It was rumored that the state actually enabled a law just to start the gentrification or the urban regeneration process in Tarlabaşı or places like Tarlabaşı that are really deteriorated in the inner city historic part of Istanbul. And considering that Tarlabaşı has been inhabited by these really disadvantaged segments of the population, you can see how the stigma can play out in Ok Meydanı as well, which is a much more stigmatized place in terms of media coverage and in terms of state-led stigmatization in the neighborhood. Because as an Istanbulite, actually, when you see a news on the TV about Ok Meydanı and you see this almost semi-war zone things happening, you'll just say to yourself, oh yeah, that's just happening all the time. We don't really think about it, we don't really care about it, because that's the state's way of numbing the local Istanbulites or the Turkish citizens against that kind of brutal, excessive police force that's happening around in these neighborhoods through urban regeneration projects, but that ends in gentrification or red gentrification. Which the same kind of stigma is actually happening in Tarlabaşı as well. There was an anecdote that when I was doing my field work, I remember the president of the Chamber of Architects visited the Tarlabaşı neighborhood right before the project was implemented, and there wasn't any evictions or anything. And the inhabitants thought that maybe the people, the Chamber of Architects, and along with them actually the municipality and the construction company are coming to the neighborhood to explain about the project and maybe give us the right to stay put in this neighborhood. So what happened is that there was actually no kind of intention from the municipality or the construction company to listen to the inhabitants, but they didn't know that, which shows the uncertainty of the project. But what they did, they all took a shower, the whole neighborhood, to show that they're clean and they're worthy of staying in this neighborhood, even though they wanted to upgrade it. which shows that how much they wanted to present themselves to the state as worthy of staying, but at the same time, which also shows that there was no intention of doing it from the beginning. And we can say that the language of state identification and the way that state not only stigmatized the residents, but also manipulated them by rumors, pretend negotiations, creating uncertainty as a way to manage and decrease the resistance to gentrification. This is also why learning that can be done from south to north is quite important, because as Bahar put it, it's really important to see this kind of informalities, and when you come from a certain type of education from the global north, you kind of tend to miss these things that are going on. Urban renewal is not always a dirty word. It's not assumed that it's going to be negative in the global northern context. But when you come from a global southern country, you understand these things a little bit differently and in little different lenses. Because when you see there's a massive urban regeneration or a state-led project that is implemented on neighbourhood, you tend to see the different and negative parts of it and the displacement that can be caused from it, which will actually help the global north when the state is behaving in a really sneaky way while implementing these projects, and in the end displacing the inhabitants in a set neighbourhood. And I would like to actually go on to talk about, in this case, about resistance to gentrification, which is a very underwritten and understudied subject in the gentrification literature, and actually pose the question to resistance to gentrification, not to speakers, but to the room as well, that what can be done, or how can we include everyday struggles, everyday practices, resistance to gentrification, to really huge anti-gentrification protests or urban unrests that are happening around the world, especially in the south, but also in the north, that now there are so many brutal projects that are happening. When gentrification is getting more aggressive, what else can we say about resistance? And is there actually a possibility to do any kind of learning or transformation of knowledge of resistance to gentrification from the global south to the north, as you can see that since there are more brutal projects happening in that part of the world. And this is actually what I'm going to talk about for the feedback for the moment, and I'd like to start the discussion with that kind of information. And if you have any question to me as well, which I Tarloshi and Loretta, and the kind of differences between market-led and state-led gentrification, of course I'm happy to answer those questions as well.
Thank you. Put your last slide up again. It's a kind of backdrop. Shall I move over?
Yes, that's great. Well, thank you so much, all four of you. It was really fascinating and brilliant, and I've furiously taken lots of notes, but this isn't about... I would actually like to open up to the floor if anyone would like to kick off with a question. We're not going to use a mic. Oh, is it working? No, let's use it if it's working. It's not really working. So, and I'd also like to take about 3 questions at a time. Please try and actually ask a question. So, anyone want to kick off?
Too shy.
Too shy. Brilliant. We've got... And then anyone else? Right, we've got 2 questions. Let's start with 2. 3, brilliant. So 1, 2... So you'll go first, you second, and then with Scarf.
Don't be scared by a group of women. It's pretty rare to have this many women in one line, so.
That's true. Ask some questions.
Go for it.
Okay, my name is Clara. I'm from Turkey. I have lived in Istanbul around 10 years. Also a human rights practitioner. So one of my questions is directly related to human rights. Because all the cases that you brought here today, thank you very much, by the way, I'm so sorry that I didn't mention, so thank you. All the cases that you brought up here today, they were all related to, as well, rights issues. We can see accommodation, of course, enforced displacement, right to health, freedom of expression, in the case of Clara, not Maiden, and fair trial. I mean, I can go on. In Turkey, if you're following Turkey close enough, human rights laws, they are not very applicable. But I'm just wondering, are there any cases in the UK or in Europe or in another Western country that gentrification issues brought up as a human rights case? Perhaps you know some of them. In UK, perhaps they and human rights law firm, they might do all such cases. My second question is very short, not that much. It's, do you guys see any difference between Sulukule and Tarlabaşı? What would be the differences between two cases? And thank you.
Thank you.
I also have two questions.
And please, yeah, do say your name and sort of
Yeah.
give a little bit of context of
Who you are.
and where you're from.
Could be a spy.
My name is Iselin, and I'm from Norway, but I've been living in Turkey for 1.5 years, so I know quite a bit about Istanbul. So my questions are relating to the state-led gentrification and which level of analysis we're looking at. So firstly, when it comes to the state-led gentrification, and we're talking about Tarlabaşı and Galata, etc., I'd just like to give an example of a squat that was in Kadıköy that was demolished about 2 years ago. And I happen to know quite a few people who are staying there, and a lot of them actually had to move to Sakizoglu after the demolition. And there's going to be built a library there or something. But this is Kadıköy, which is, for those who don't know, is an oppositional council, runs it. And also, I went to Loretta's talk. We had a talk in Cambridge House in Southwark.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there was a screening of Disposition, which is a really, really good movie for those who are interested in the gentrification issue in England and Ireland, etc. And also there was a lot of talk about these labour councils who have been actually running a lot of the gentrification process, although they're also in opposition. So even in neighbourhoods that are in opposition, we see this taking place. So I guess my question is, what can we do about it? And then my second question, or my topic for discussion, is what I think is special about Turkey, maybe different from other countries, is the state-led gentrification that goes on outside of the borders of Turkey. So actually, there are lots of projects that Turkey runs, like building mosques in areas in Cyprus or in Albania, lots of places around the world. I don't know if you can call it not necessarily gentrification, it's more like just urban projects, which is outside of the state, but by the state. So I think this is an interesting topic because it's about this global gentrification, maybe it's a bit unusual or colonial even.
Great. Should we take one more? There's, yeah, sure. So we'll,
I'll try my best.
thanks.
My name's Sarah, and in LSE I studied geography here in Clara, but now I work for the Greater London. I was interested to hear your comparison with Turkey and Amsterdam, and how you said that there are actually more informalities in the Western context, and I just wanted you to, I was curious as to what those are, and you could expand on that. And I know London well, not so much Turkey, but whether you have any examples in any context where there has actually been successful estate regeneration and renewal.
Nice. Okay, so maybe Loretta, do you want to kick off with the human rights? Because I think you were heavily involved with a case in London where that can be attended to, and then maybe you can pick up on the opposition.
Okay.
And then we'll filter onto the other questions.
Okay. Yeah, so the paper I mentioned in my talk, the city paper that's coming out anytime soon is all about the way that the European Convention for Human Rights was used in the first Aylesbury Estate public inquiry, which we won, and it set a precedent, although long story, it got overturned, so we're back to a revised Aylesbury Estate public inquiry. But we won it on human rights issues. We won it on displacements, predominantly of ethnic minority communities, and the idea that they wouldn't be able to recreate those communities elsewhere because they were particular to the place that they lived in London on that particular estate. So this goes some way to what I was talking about before around thinking about what you can win these cases on, whether it's about loss of home, whether it's about loss of community, loss of place. It's quite difficult to do it on loss of home, but it becomes more easy legally to do it around loss of place and loss of community. And again, that's what we're trying to do in the second Aylesbury public inquiry. So yes, there are ideas, but that's, you know, the European Convention of Human Rights is not going to help Turkey because they're not quite in Europe in that same way. Local politics, yes, so one of my slides was the whole HDV saga in Haringey. One of the ironies is that there is cross-party political support, apart from for the Green Party, for council estate demolition in London. And some of the worst boroughs that have been leading it are Labour-run boroughs like Lambeth, like Southwark, like Haringey. Some of this is a kind of difference between kind of New Labour ideology that came through mixed communities policy, which came out of the New Labour government when it came in 97. But it's not as simple as that, actually. Some of it is quite simply brainwashing or fear of many of these local Labour councils that they need to do something for their population, which they do, and there's just no money from central government, etc., to do it. But that's not an excuse for, you know, kicking out most of your residents and replacing them with the rich. So, do you want to answer the...
Actually, just before we move on, because I was actually going to ask a question quite similar to that, and I think, and I do actually want to ask it in that is this there is this sort of rise of municipalism throughout Europe and beyond, and actually a wonderful history of sort of socialism in municipalities, even in the United States, where the S word is deemed to never be said. What are the implications for municipalism?
Well, I mean, if you follow the kind of Twitter stuff on the HDV and actually the media coverage as well, it talks about the kind of re-rise of municipal socialism, you know, kind of going back to the kind of, you know, the days when your local council looked after the welfare of their population rather than did property development. So,
Right, so Clara, there was a specific question to you, and then maybe anyone else can pick up on the others, the sort of differences and successes that we can celebrate.
I think I want to add about this human rights aspect first. Like, there's been quite some activism around the human rights aspect of evictions and displacement in Turkey as well. And especially, I know, like, quite some urban activists who are as well human rights activists just mobilize certain institutions, like especially regarding the Roma rights, for instance. And there's really a lot of going in there. And also writing reports for the Human Rights Watch and mobilizing Amnesty.
Amnesty International.
Yeah, has been really, I mean, this was really the first time that Amnesty was so active in the field of urban and zero evictions campaign also did the same thing. So there's quite a lot of links going on, but since the state is so brutal and violent, these things are working to a certain extent. This is why we hear about them more often in the Western context than in the Turkey context. But it is there, for sure there. But their power has a limitation when it comes to pressing down on the national interest.
I mentioned about the Western countries, because in Turkey it's not applicable, the rights,
Okay.
even though there is a narrative and the within the society and acted by the activists as well. But looking for claiming your rights could be even more harming and dangerous for, you know, like, as we can see behind the academics in Turkey.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. I would like you to ask the question again, because I was just busy with like thinking about the first question. Sorry for this, really. But as far as I understood, like you're asking the specific aspects that I saw in the Amsterdam case regarding informality, or did I get it right?
What were those informalities?
Yeah, I mean.
How were they different from the Turkish context, or what was it surprising?
Yeah, for me it was like what was I expecting is like everything, like the rights and the duties are so well defined, and everything is just acting according to the plan, basically. This is just what I read everywhere, and it's just there, and they have the rights to do this and that. But especially when it comes to access to the rights, like for instance, when it comes to ethnic minorities, they don't really know how the things are functioning, like how the system is functioning. And then they use a lot of informal social networks to get to access to these places. This is one thing from the side of the residents. And on the side of the state authorities, whenever there's always a negotiation of like, if you're going back to a renovated block, there's always a negotiation which part you can go. But some people, especially the native, like ethnically Dutch, are doing these negotiations, but not the ethnically Dutch ones. So if there's sort of a resistance in the block, or just sort of a community in the block, then they share these sorts of things, like knowledge sharing or transfer happening. And then also the ethnic minorities are having access to these sorts of rights or negotiations. And on the part of the authorities, again, they basically give more rights when needed. Like they say, like, okay, this is not really the way that we function, but let's just see the possibility for this. Like when it comes to strong mobilization, they just try to not make it accelerated. So if you ask the right questions, you get in there, but normally you don't see these sorts of things.
But can I just add, so, I mean, there's informality in London. If you look at beds with sheds and subletting and stuff like that, it actually, at the end of the day, it's very little difference between that and, you know, informal settlements elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Europe thinks that it doesn't have slums. You go to Lisbon in Portugal, the inner rings of Lisbon are real, what we would consider to be real slums in the development kind of geography sense. So there is a lot of kind of crisscrossing back and forth.
And actually, just, I mean, on that subject, you know, I was recently talking to councillors in Barking and Dagenham who know that they have a huge problem with sort of these suburban houses being chopped up into these subdivided rooms. Mm-hmm. But rather than fight that on like a human rights issue, on a kind of, they would rather talk about look and feel and sort of pebble dash than actually claim these sort of, because that's a safer space to be in. Mm-hmm. And I find that sort of, and it's also, I think, a sort of mechanism of not talking about it as a sort of slum, sort of a denial, and talking about it as an aesthetic instead, and not a moral condition. Not wanting to make a moral judgment in a way.
So I wanted to pick. This quote in Kadikar that you mentioned. Sorry, I forgot your name. We almost also visited that squad at the time, and it was because I think there was quite a bit of awe around it, because it was one of the first kind of politically obvious quotes that was happening. And then you mentioned how being an opposition neighbourhood, how could that happen? Something that came through the interviews that I did in Okmeydan, especially because you have these two administrative units, and one is AKP and the other one is CHP. Most of the dwellers, when asked if they thought it would make any difference if there was another government in power, said that they didn't. Because it's actually the system itself, rather than the political party. So, unless this is... Do you want some water? Unless this... some water. No, don't worry. So unless the system actually changed, their view was that these sort of networks of nepotism, this, the clientelism, etc., still going to be there whether you are from one side or the other.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any difference.
It's the same in
Yeah.
London.
And actually, to add to that, for the slums in Kadıköy, there are some slums that are mostly inhabited by Roma citizens, and they're so appalled by the whole idea of state or regulation that they wouldn't even send their children, they wouldn't even attend their children's graduation just so that they wouldn't be on the land of that is governed by a state. So it's mostly the informality and that kind of idea comes from this distrust to the state rather than the party itself. Of course, AKP is increasing that notion, but...
Does anyone want to tackle successful state-led regeneration?
outside Turkey.
Huh?
Outside.
Just, yeah, or anywhere.
Well, somebody asked a question about state-led gentrification outside Turkey.
Yeah.
We can-
I mean, there are lots of examples of other
Yes.
countries doing that, like China and South Africa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically land grabbing around the world, and it's, you know, whoever can get hold of whatever and gentrify it.
I think it's more like who, exactly, who can get there first.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the kind of, I don't know, like politics of do we mind if it's a war zone or we don't mind, or you know, being in. I went to northern Iraq and there were developments that Turkey was very much involved with. You know, already eyeing the fact that it was going to be a very peaceful area to be able to develop and urbanize, in fact. And you find in Africa especially this situation.
I think Naomi Klein writes about this a lot, sort of disaster capitalism. And I heard a story at Harvard after 9/11. One of the design teachers, this might be a rumor, one of the design teachers at GSD said, you know, maybe everyone wants to take a day off from teaching today. And one of the students says, well, no, this is actually going to be a great opportunity for architects, so we should keep on going. And I think, yeah. So,
Disturbing.
good
examples of regeneration? I mean,
That's
a good
the only
example
thing
of regeneration is not gentrification. And I think that's one of the problems. People conflate those two words. You know, gentrification is a negative process that displaces people. Regeneration is something that keeps people in place and helps their lives. So I think a lot of the debates do tend to mix these two terms, which is problematic.
And in that sense, any city could offer examples, because all cities grow, and even pockets of neighbourhoods that we might not know of could offer insights for how to do it well. Right, should we take another round of questions? So we've got one at the back, and second one here, and a third one there. Fantastic.
Okay.
Right, you can kick off.
I'm Chidoke. I'm from London originally. I studied in Manchester and came over to Manchester recently. You will know that it's changed a lot. I actually done my dissertation on gentrification, and thankfully I'm going to study MSc this September in regional urban planning studies. I was going to ask her, for Professor Loretta. In fact, thank you from all the panelists, but especially to Professor Loretta. You were saying earlier how the kind of holistic causes of gentrification, and you mentioned money laundering, and you mentioned speculative kind of land-based trading, but I didn't hear you mention kind of renters and the demand for housing.
Sorry, say that again?
I didn't hear you mention renters and the demand for housing. And that's someone who would like to be on the property ladder one day. To what extent do people like me and prospective house buyers have on gentrification? And do we have any power of where we would like to buy houses on preventing gentrification-induced displacement?
Interesting question.
Right.
My name is Martin. I'm an actor and a playwright, and I'm putting together a season of plays that will be placed this year, examining the subject of gentrification and posing questions such as, you know, who has the right to the city, how place helps us construct ideas of identity, etc., etc. Question for Professor Rota. I'm a born-bred Londoner, and you mentioned at the beginning of your talk how you felt there are various actors who are complicit in gentrification or state-led gentrification, and you mentioned very quickly the GLA. I think Sadiq Khan on Monday, he announced plans that properties that are new build properties that are worth no more than 350k. Londoners will get to see it first before presumably kind of foreign investors. And bearing in mind what you said about some of the worst boroughs in London that have been spearheading really quite aggressive forms of state gentrification, Lambeth, Southwark, Harringay. I was wondering, did you have any sense of hope about what the GLA and the Sadiq Khan might play in maybe reversing some of the really negative impacts of state gentrification?
Okay. And the last question here.
My name is Yomi, born and bred in London, Hackney in specific. Question to Loretta. Basically, I know you spoke about the stigmatization of certain areas that were quite prevalent with urban decay, and the question was basically, do you know any examples of redevelopment in areas in the Western world that have had a positive effect on the local community and its people, and if so, what were the measures that were put in place to ensure that?
Okay, I'll answer those quickly, and then I think given we're talking about Turkey, we'll get some questions on Turkey. So I think the question on renters and on people who obviously want to get on the property ladder is a really complex one. And it can be conflated with, for example, there's a whole row over how people like myself who are against gentrification shouldn't support leaseholders, for example, because they have bought their properties through right to buy and they're taking council property off the poor, etc., etc. So there's a whole complex moral set of arguments around this. But I think my response would be that there isn't a property shortage or a housing shortage as such that has been kind of constructed. What's happened is that there's difficulty getting onto that ladder because the prices have been escalated so much. So I think there's a difference. So we're sold this story there's a housing shortage and that the industry has to go out and build more houses. We don't actually need more houses. We need the prices to come down so that young people can afford, if they so desire, to buy a property. And Manchester, I think, is a really interesting case at the moment because it's following London in many ways. It's the second most economically successful. I'm originally from Manchester, city in the UK, and it's beginning to experience many of the same processes that London's been undergoing over the last 10 years. So that's my response to that. The Sadiq question's an interesting one. There are certain key players in the GLA who've been very good over the last couple of years, Sian Berry in particular, who's head of the Housing Committee, in lobbying Sadiq, using some of the work that I've done and work that other people have done, particularly around his estate renewal guidance and stuff like that. The problem is that much of what he's announced recently will not be retroactive to estates that have already been, these programmes have already been kicked off. And there's about 50 or 60 estates at the moment where Gressingham Gardens, for example, is a prime one, and the Aylesbury is another one. It's not going to do anything for those, and we're talking of 200,000 people being kicked out of inner London on these estates. So that stuff will come in, but it's too late for these other people, and something needs to be stopped at the local level right now to stop that, not at the GLA level.
So you said there are about 50 or 60 council estates in London?
Yeah, I mean, the data, I've just developed a database, we've been collating a database, and we estimate between 150 to 180,000 people have been ejected from London or in the process of being ejected since 1997, low-income groups from council estates. The last one on Hackney, I mean, one of the examples of successful urban redevelopment I often talk about, I lived in Vancouver in Canada for 2.5 years, and there was a redevelopment, a mixed income redevelopment called False Creek South, which was undertaken in Vancouver, which in my mind was properly successful. It was properly tenure blind, it was properly mixed income, it was mixing people across all income strata. It included housing for the elderly, housing for different age groups, different types of architectures and streetscapes, property. I mean, it basically ticked every box you can imagine. But it's one of the few ones that has been successful. But it was under a very particular government at a very particular time locally in Vancouver that did have a very kind of left liberal idea about livability and quality of life in downtown Vancouver. that was wiped out by a kind of neoconservative government that got in fairly quickly after. So the local politics do determine what can work and what can't.
What was the name of that project?
False Creek South. False Creek South. That's in downtown Vancouver.
I'll just add quickly another success story from Turkey. You might have heard, you might want to look it up. There's an association called Bir Umut, and they work basically voluntarily, architects, planners, and they developed a project for Düzce. So it was an area that was destroyed by an earthquake. So they worked with the local dwellers that used to live there to design new houses, and it seems so far they've been able to build them. So for me it's a really interesting success story considering the conditions right now, so to take note on that also.
I was wondering if you wanted to pick up on some of the themes that are being brought up here about sort of the role of the state, and you talked about the politics of time and also the politics of knowledge, which I think, Clara, you talked up, and I think these are really important tools that are often used. And what we see in London is that actually you have really elongated time and then very accelerated time, and actually I think these are active tools that are used. And so I was just wondering if you wanted to add to that in the context of Turkey, what's similar, what's different, and just sort of ping against some of the sort of these very London-based questions.
What we had basically, like I think in the very beginning we should just make this distinction, like when the new urban renewal and transformation laws were being actually made, there were a lot of preparations, institutional as well as legislative preparations for these processes to happen, and this was in the first half of 2000s. So there were a lot of rumors, a lot of like things to happen, and people were actually like not people, the architects, the experts. Let me put it that way. We're just making tours in the neighborhood, like making analysis of the current physical situations and everything. And the different municipalities were doing this to have sort of an inventory of knowledge of their neighborhoods. And what came after that, I mean, all these presence of people in the neighborhoods and the rumors of, like, from the media, actually, like the entire Leicester people learned about renewal from media, from newspapers, before anything happened. So it was really long-lasting process of like raising hopes, because like here EU will invest in, people were just saying here EU will invest in and everyone will get sort of rich. This was just the beginning of the story. And then what happened in 2008, 2009, it got really accelerated so fast. Like, I mean, from 2005, the beginning, the rumors, and then 2009, like in 4 years, you had like an extended waiting period, and then no one did anything. Instead, except the investors, like big investors collected a lot of property around the neighborhood. So this is still the case. Like, and people are still waiting to do something with those neighborhoods. And the ones actually wanted to get out of the neighborhood and felt quite stuck in the neighborhood. The property owners, like, I mean, an owner of a building sold their houses to move somewhere else. This is how the community also kind of cracked down. Like, I mean, there was the big effect of it. And then the negotiations with the municipality and the private companies started. That also made it sort of hopeful, that they thought in the beginning that something would come out of that. But I think there's this turning point that the negotiations was stopped. And that was in 2010, let's say, like almost 5 years from the beginning. And that became like sort of the turning point that everyone actually started to think about their own position and not expecting anything and trying to find a way out of the situation, except the ones who couldn't do anything because they didn't have the economic resources to do so. And I'm talking about a neighborhood where people are relegated to stay there. So it was a long-lasting waiting for many. and still is the case, and it also increased the rent levels and everything in the very adjacent areas, and also the incoming of the Syrian refugees made the rents double or triple in the area. So it was really a huge impact. The politics of time is really important in that sense, and I think we're missing a lot. I mean, you can go back and see it in the rent cap theory. This is all about like disinvestment, decay, and followed by an investment, but we don't actually work on this, like how this entire process is managed. So the idea is stemming from that.
We should start thinking about wrapping up, but do you have anything you want to comment on based on any of the questions?
For the case of Tarlabaşı, also exactly, we were talking about the politics of time, that it was actually seen as a success that it took so long, because they took that as because there were so many lawsuits that were filed against individual and collective against the project, that they thought that since they kind of postponed the project to start, it gave them a false sense of hope, which turned out to be something else, the opposite actually. They just went on in circles and circles in legal battles, but people were feeling quite hopeful about Tarlabaşı in the beginning because they couldn't start the project. So in this case, maybe if the legal process was handled better, or I don't know if there were many more kind of lawsuits that opened against it, maybe it could have made a difference, but I guess the way they postponed it on and on and on gave them the false hope, which kind of changed the hopeful situation that was in 2009 and 2010, even 2011.
Right. Unless there a pressing last question.
I have a very quick one.
Brilliant. We'll take that as our last pressing question.
Yeah, so I think that what Bahar was just talking about was, so I've just come back from a few years of research in Turkey. I'm an anthropologist, but I wasn't looking at gentrification as my kind of interest. But I was looking at graffiti. And that ties in quite kind of nicely. And I was looking at places like Kurtuluş, and around there, your proximity to sort of Taksim and places like that, you're seeing rent prices go up really fast recently. Now, is that in relation to any, I mean, I don't know Şişli's kind of mindset regarding this, but I know the JHP tend to be slightly less aggressive in their kind of pursuit of gentrification, or rather cancellation, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, I was just wondering whether that was the kind of increase in prices is related to these large firms buying up properties and the actual whole area increasing, even without distinct projects being in the pipeline, as it were. Is that what we're seeing all around central Istanbul?
I talked a lot. Do you want to say something? I mean, I have an answer to this, but maybe it's
I'll start.
Yeah. Okay.
It's very interesting because, so in fact, I stay in Kurtuluş quite a bit, and you can totally see what's happening. I think basically, there are foreigners coming to live in the area. You hear much more different languages than before, and I think they've been pushed out also by rent prices in Cihangir or in Beyoğlu rising at the same time. All of a sudden you see I think, very traditional process of gentrification of the little cafes and the little bars, etc. But what I find still quite interesting in Kurtuluş is that there's a lot of mingling with African migrants, with the Armenian historical residents in the area. So whether this is going to turn into, the most, the underprivileged are going to be pushed out, we'll see. It depends also, I think, on the national economic dynamics, if Turkey will come back from where it is heading right now or not. But I think it's a super interesting case, actually, so thanks for bringing it up.
I think that's a very interesting case in the sense that it really pushes us to look at the city and the development of one district within a city in a very relational way. That is so important because as we first had the gentrification in the very historical center, like the Beyoğlu and then Cihangir, and then not in the historical sense, in the sequential way, and in Galata, all these places, but some of them getting more expensive. and some of them getting more like the attraction of Arab tourists or the Islamic influence or the bombings. Like we need to really put the politics of the wars in the Middle East into the picture, because once you had the bombings in the middle of Taksim, everyone actually, I mean, there wasn't no investment anymore, and it really affected all the area, and people actually wanted to move out, and many progressives, like so-called, or they moved like from Beyoğlu area to Kadıköy area. So this is like now Kadıköy is the back in time, like 10 years before Beyoğlu, basically. Like, I mean, it is quite a shift of these centers and gentrification and the rising rent prices and everything. They are related, and also Cihangir becoming too expensive. Many people just moved to Tarlabaşı. I mean, there are certain parts of Tarlabaşı, we are talking about really stigmatized parts, but there are certain parts of Tarlabaşı that you would think like all the activists, all the like artists, like high in cultural capital, low in economic capital, living in these places, not yet hipsters, but the marginal gentrifiers, so to say. And all these are happening in relation to each other, and then there's really a lot of differences in between. But what makes Kurtuluş specific and an important case is that there's really a lot of multicultural dynamic and also class dynamics and sexuality. I mean, they're like transgender used to be sex worker activists, now working in a grocery shop, for instance, in Kurtuluş. This is really a big thing. Like this, there's this sort of the daily, I don't want to use this term, but like the tolerance, the living together, the culture of living together. Yes, this is a better one. So developing there, and kind of people who are at the margins, both in activism, both in backgrounds, like different backgrounds, so just coming together in these neighborhoods. And the neighborhood name is also like Kurtuluş, which is like the being saved, like it's a safe place for for the outcasts now, sort of.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to you guys for being here and staying a little bit late, and for your wonderful questions. And thank you to all four of you for your brilliant insights. And thank you so much to our organisers for bringing together this wonderful cohort. And it was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.